Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Trey Orndorff, a political scientist at Oklahoma Christian University. I'm joined by Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University, as we tackle a busy week in politics. Michael, how are you doing this week?
I'm doing okay. How about you, Trey?
Well, I am slowly but surely becoming a Sooner, so I
Oh,
guess the
wow.
sooner, the better.
Oh. We're going to just move on and pretend you didn't say that, I think.
I didn't sing anything from like Oklahoma, so I'm saving that for a future week.
Yes, let's save that.
So this week, I think one of the overarching stories has been the legacy and the passing of Senator McCain, and then obviously a number of the more petty questions that I think, and larger, more substance questions that has come out of it. So, Michael, what do you think is the legacy of John McCain in the political system as a senator? And to what extent do you think his passing has had any kind of impact this week on the political system?
Well, I've been doing a lot of thinking about that this last week, Trey. I actually was a big fan of John McCain. For a long time, I remember very well his 2000 presidential candidate. In fact, that was the first and only presidential campaign I've ever donated to. Essentially, got the T-shirt, the whole bit, and I was on board with John McCain. And I think the reason why I sort of appreciated him for his whole career is John McCain is sort of a dying breed. I heard somebody describe him as sort of a romantic Republican, and I sort of like that idea. And I think what it has to do with is this sense that duty, honor, and country were words, were phrases that had real meaning and gave direction to his life and what he did in politics in a way that we just don't see a whole lot anymore when it's just sort of angling for strategic advantage and that sort of thing. And which is not to say that John McCain didn't do some of that, but he to me represents a very different era in the Senate as well. A much less polarized era. I went and looked back because John McCain came into the Senate and I believe it was 1987. And if we look at, and you'll be familiar with this, Trey, if we look at voting patterns in the Senate, what you see is that the polarization really started to pick up around a decade ago, or around 2008, 2009, and through there. And 57 of the current members of the Senate came into office after then. So they've never really known that sort of Senate that was, where people work together and that sort of thing. And that was the Senate that John McCain came into. And there was also this era in the 80s when McCain really first came into the Senate, which was much less partisan. And right now, there are only like 6, I counted, current senators who actually remember that era, which, I think for me, it was a much better era when things got done and things weren't so incredibly negative and polarized. And, I think John McCain's passing just as one more senator from that era who's gone. Just that time, unfortunately, is now a time of the past. And that makes me really sad.
No, and I think that one of the things that's interesting about McCain, now I fall into a slightly different category. When he was running for president, I did not own the T-shirt, but that didn't mean that you had to think that he was a horrendous individual to disagree with his policies. But I think one of the things that's fascinating about McCain that is a positive part of his legacy was when he was running, one of the questions that kind of ran around, I don't remember this, but there was a suggestion that he might actually have a Democrat on his vice presidential ticket.
Yep.
And
Joe Lieberman.
Exactly. Yeah. As a matter of fact, it came so close that a good friend of mine, I still have it in my office, made a fake cover of National Review that says "What in the world," and it has McCain picking Joe Lieberman because they thought that was going to be the pick, And I don't think that there are many candidates who that story would have had any legs, because who would ever have, you know, what other candidate would there have been any kind of even probable possibility that they would have picked somebody from the other party to be their vice presidential candidate? And I
Right.
think on that kind of front that you see the kind of individual that McCain was. So even if you don't or did not agree with his policies, I think it's really difficult to think of him as being anything but somebody who was constantly doing what he thought was best, not for himself, but for the institution and legacy of his country.
Yeah, absolutely. I also thought was interesting. I don't know if you know this. That it turns out that McCain and Ted Kennedy, of course, both died of brain cancer, and it was on the exact same day, 9 years apart, which was a bizarre sort of coincidence. But of course, McCain worked with Kennedy, and certainly they didn't see eye to eye on a lot of things. But that was the sort of Senate that we had back in the day when they could do that, even when presidents could work with senators of the other party. And now the idea that that would happen just seems to be just it totally bizarre.
But one of the things that I think his passing allows us to reflect on is that, I think sometimes when we talk about the past and versus the present, and there's things in the present that we don't like or that we wish could be different, the present isn't a fixed substance, right? And so the changes that the way we vote now will have impacts on the future. And I think one of the things that when we have moments of pause, when we look back at a longer time frame, so when you're talking about, the 80s, when McCain comes in, and do we like or not like the shifts, it's easy to always think, because we're stuck in it in a sense, of the present as being a fixed substance. But of course, we can't look backwards and say, look how things are different, if we assume that the future will always be identical to the way that it is now. And so in these kinds of moments, we might want to ask ourselves, what changes could we make in the present so that when we look back again, right, so when the next senator passes, that we might be able to say, well, look how much better things are on this metric this time.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, but I maybe you're a little more optimistic than I am, Trey. I don't know, or maybe I'm just having a pessimistic week. I would like to think that that's possible, but this is one of my weeks where I wonder about that sort of thing. Though one other thing, although I did want to mention is, Joe Biden, of course, gave one of the eulogies at the Arizona service, and boy, Joe Biden to me represents the kind of person I would love to have as a Democrat. I would love to have the opportunity to vote for. But the fact that Joe Biden is 74 years old is a bit scary to me. But he's the sort of kind of moderate-ish, sort of happy warrior type of guy who that's the sort of person who I love to support. And I think John McCain was, very much like that. But it's getting harder and harder to find those people. And I think, I certainly share your hope that there could be more of these people. But gosh, it's sure hard to see how that is going to happen.
It happens one voter at a time.
Yeah, I suppose you're right, Trey. Like I said, I'm not trying to be a big doubter, but yeah, maybe just the fact of his passing is sort of making it hard for me to be a little optimistic. But I hope you're right, certainly.
No, and I agree. And I understand that this week has been a tough one. As a matter of fact, I think that it was a really hard one I'm not sure about for you, but at least for me, it was a really hard one to engage on social media this week for me because of the number of just kind of horrendous supportings of outlandish claims about McCain. And it just made you want to shake your head and say, sometimes you see things like that and you think, maybe free speech. How well does this work? So I understand that, but I think that's one of the reasons we try to do a show like this.
Yeah, what reminds me of it, this was a famous moment from, I don't know, famous, but a moment from in the 2008 presidential campaign when, of course, McCain was taking his second shot at the presidency, running against Barack Obama. And he was doing a town hall or some kind of a meeting. And one woman in the crowd said that, that Obama was an Arab, I think she called him, and she didn't trust him. And McCain responded to the effect of, "No, that's wrong. He's a good family man. He's a good American who loves his country. We just fundamentally disagree on some things." And that's the sort of thing that you just don't hear as much of, and that's what made me love John McCain.
Yeah, that was an amazing kind of moment when you juxtapose it with the kind of personal attacks that the current occupant of the White House.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I don't want to get into that whole, did he or didn't he order the flag to be run back up again or something like that. And I'm
Yeah.
sure listeners know what we're talking about. But that seems to be just a sort of petty, vindictive sort of thing that just makes me despair. But anyway.
Well, on that, I am sure that there are many people who are still mourning his passing, and we hope that his family, not that we know them personally, has comfort as time moves forward.
Yeah.
And I think it's time for us to move forward as well from that kind of sad note on the passing of John McCain to talking about some policy. And I think the big policy this week, Michael, has been the NAFTA renegotiation, or might be called the do away with NAFTA 2 bilateral agreements, or the NAFTA 2.0. There's a lot of kind of questions lingering out here. But the short version is the United States and Mexico reached an quote-unquote understanding on several critical trade issues while they were talking in bilateral talks. Canada is now back and re-engaged in some talks, but that actually broke the Friday deadline. Now, Congress is unlikely to suddenly start calling out on this, but it's interesting because we now have the NAFTA is potentially either going to go away or come back in a new form. And so, Michael, one of the things that this has kind of made me wonder, and I'm curious about your take, is a lot of listeners on the right, and I think even yourself a few weeks ago said, well, I really, really hope that Donald Trump's kind of seemingly erratic trade policy, maybe it will lead to something better. So is Mexico and Canada willing to come to the table? Is this a potential win for Trump? How do you see that playing out here?
Yeah, I've got some thoughts on that, but yeah, just quickly for listeners who aren't clear about the deadline thing, I wanted to, because I was a little unclear about it as well at first. So what you're referring to, Trey, of course, is that there's no real deadline. The idea here is that they want to have an agreement in place and ready to go, so the current president of Mexico can sign it, and the president-elect takes office on December 1st. And the way this works is that once the president announces a deal, he has to give Congress 90 days notice before this officially starts. And that meant that Friday was the deadline for that 90 days to come before December 1st, essentially, and so that everyone could still be on board. But it turns out that that's a little bit softer of a deadline. And the reason why is that even though the deadline was, well, yesterday, because we're taping on Saturday, actually, President Trump, the administration, sent notification to Congress because they have an additional 30 days to actually send the text of the agreement. So they're sort of finessing that deadline thing. So basically, the real deadline comes in another month, and so the hope is that Canada will get on board within a month on that, and then it'll still be okay before that December 1st thing. So, but I just wanted to clarify that my sense of things, though. I guess my main reaction to this is that once again, it shows me that Donald Trump is not a free trader. And if you look at some of the main parts of this Canada or this Mexico agreement, which we don't have the text of, we only have some outlines and that sort of thing, at least of the final agreement. A couple of things: that the provision that 40 to 45% of cars made under this new agreement have to be made by workers making at least $16 an hour. And immediately I thought, well, wait a minute. This is being pushed by a Republican president. The Republican Party is the same party that says, my God, minimum wage laws are awful things. And so Orthodox Republicans should hate this because it's the same logic that is, the same argument against raising or even having a federal minimum wage. So this is kind of a protectionist type of thing. This is definitely not a free trade sort of thing. And this $16 an hour is like up to 4 times as much as what some Mexican auto manufacturers currently pay. That'll be interesting to see how well that's enforced. But I wanted to get your take as a libertarian. I mean, this is essentially, this is not free trade in any ways. This is what some liberals call fair trade. But it's a very different sort of thing. But as a libertarian, what's your take on this?
Well, I wish that I could say that I was surprised, but Donald Trump is not a free trader. He is not an open market man. And of all of the things that he said or not said, this is the one that he has been the most singularly focused. I mean, at no point has he ever kind of waffled back and forth on he's always about the better deal. And the implied assumption is that when you're openly trading with somebody, you're getting a bad deal unless you can get in your own provisions. And so it's been fascinating to me on this front because I agree with you. I mean, what you see happening here, which again, we need to put a caveat in, what we're getting is from sources inside the negotiations, right? And then some of the basic kind of outlines of it, because the text of the deal isn't available yet. We can't look at it like you were just saying. So from my point of view, I think that this is a horrendous step backwards. It's a big step backwards in the sense that we are increasing. Part of this is the idea that we need to have more percentages of vehicles and other things have to be produced in the United States. Well, that just means you're going to be driving up costs on things. And that's not good for the average consumer here in the United States. But again, I'm not shocked.
Let's be clear. This is a tax on consumers. I mean, that's what it boils down to from a libertarian perspective, from an economic perspective. That cost increase is going to be passed on to people who are buying cars.
And this is into an environment where we're already having costs being passed down from the China increases. So, these are going to add up in real ways. And I think that it's not going to be now that people start to realize the impact that this is going to have on their bottom lines.
Yeah, and this is not a progressive tax. This is this is essentially a tax that's going to have greater impacts on people who are at the lower end of the income scale who are buying new vehicles for the most part. I would argue. And another thing I wanted to point out is that also this week, and this is related, the European Union said essentially, well, you know what? Why don't we just do away with tariffs on all of our vehicles, on U.S. vehicles, European vehicles, Europe? And the Trump administration's response was, well, no, because we want to sell more vehicles. We don't. And so they basically called his bluff, and the administration said, well, no, because we're not actually about free flow of goods and services. We're about essentially this win-lose type of situation, and that. Like I said, that to me is just incredibly short-sighted. It suggests a complete lack of understanding of why free trade in the long run is better for everyone. And but again, just like you, I am not surprised at all.
Well, and one of the questions that a lot of listeners ask me is, well, why don't you end up siding with Democrats more often? And the answer is, well, if Republicans keep acting like this, I'll have to, because they're going to have the same exact trade policies. When Bernie Sanders was talking about wanting to dismantle NAFTA, this is exactly what he was talking about. They just used different kinds of language. But I'm just shocked that rank and file Republicans are going to go along with this. I mean, yeah. Donald Trump doing it does not surprise me, but if this actually gets ratified, and that's fascinating to me that Republicans are going to flip so hard. And I wonder if they're even do they realize, or are they is it for political gain here, that they're basically taking the Sanders foreign policy position on trade?
Yeah. And that to me is an interesting part of it as well, because it, like I said before, Orthodox Republicans should hate this idea, what this stands for. And I guess I start to wonder, well, this is the kind of deal that actually you would expect to see a Democrat, a left of center president propose? And does ideological orthodoxy mean anything anymore? Or is it just all about winning, building an electoral coalition and the heck with what we're supposed to stand for? We stand for winning elections, apparently, and that's a real bummer.
Well, and it would be an interesting historical capper on either side, right? Because NAFTA is going to go into effect by a Democratic president who ran on basically a worker platform, Bill Clinton, and then ends up instituting NAFTA or signing NAFTA. And then on the other end, we might very well end up with a Republican president undoing it.
Right. Yeah.
And putting it back to the worker position on the other side, which goes to your point, which is just it would be a fascinating bookends on that.
Yeah. And I should point out that one thing that President Trump is absolutely right about is Canada's dairy tariffs, which is it's pretty crazy. They have this dairy supply management system essentially, which is just like very serious quotas. It was this whole thing designed to really take care of Canada's domestic dairy industry, and it totally goes against what free trade is all about. But it has such strong support from a pretty powerful bloc in Canada that's unlikely to go anywhere. So certainly Canada is not this, aggrieved party in all of this. That's a huge problem. And, whenever Donald Trump is right about something, I feel it's important to point it out, so as people don't think I just decide reflexively that if Donald Trump is for it, I must be against it, because on the dairy program, he's absolutely right.
Yeah, and what's interesting is, keep in mind, I don't think any of these free trade agreements, every single element of them is perfectly free trade. I mean, in an ideal world as libertarian, that's what I would like. But when you're the hope is always to be moving in that direction, of course. And you've got to be pragmatic. So I think you're right. You've got to take it and say, well, what direction in general is this trade agreement moving towards, right? As opposed to, is everything in it exactly? But well, moving to a little bit less of
Trey, before we move on, I totally forgot. Sorry about that, but I was hoping we could thank. We have a new supporter this week, so do you mind if we take a minute?
We need to take a minute for that.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Well, that's great. Well, our newest supporter is Michelle. Michelle's our newest monthly contributing supporter on Patreon. We really appreciate that, Michelle. Thank you so much for helping us keep the show going. And of course, when you do contribute to the show as a financial supporter, not only do you have that the knowledge that you are keeping us in microphones and server space and all that stuff we absolutely need to do, but also you get our supporters bonus show. Last week, Jay and I were doing the show, and we talked about the escalating trade war between the U.S. and China. Speaking of trade, international agreements, and also that whole Donald Trump versus Jeff Sessions thing. This week, I know, Trey, you and I have some good stuff lined up, so there's that. So yeah, again, thanks, Michelle. And if you want to join Michelle, just go to politicsguys.com/support. That's a direct link, or just politicsguys.com, and you'll see the support links, and we really do appreciate it.
Yes, we do. I mean, that is what makes it happen. So on to the next story, which is Trump decided to take on Google. Now, this is fascinating for a number of reasons, not so much because Trump decided to go after somebody. I mean, all you have to do is look at his Twitter feed for 30 seconds. And he has been a particularly active Twitter user this week. So we're not trying to focus on all of this. But what's particularly interesting about this story is that oftentimes when politicians come out against companies, it is generally best practice for the company to just say nothing. They don't generally respond. They don't enter into the political conversation in that sense, in general. However, this time, after Donald Trump basically tweets out, "Stop the bias," that Google was giving top billing for States of the Union addresses for Obama and not for him, Google basically wrote back and said, well, one, buddy, you don't understand what kind of address you had, and two, we've been doing this forever, so there. Is a really fascinating, just the fact that they were going to come back in such a harsh way against Trump. So what do you think about this is the tip of a large iceberg of complaints between Donald Trump and major companies What do you think about Google's approach to this and what it means that Trump continues to come after them?
Well, I guess my initial response to the president's attacks that is that word rigged. He loves the word rigged, and it's a word that sets my teeth on edge. I got to tell you, Trey, because it just basically it that's his move. That's his first move, is to call into question the legitimacy of anything that attacks Donald Trump or that suggests Donald Trump is anything other than this perfect person whose every idea is brilliant, essentially. And that to me is fundamentally why I have a problem with Donald Trump. Not so much policy, though gosh knows there's a ton of stuff with that, but that he's so willing to call into question the legitimacy of anything. He does far more than any other politician. And, obviously he doesn't know how search works. Obviously, he just was simply wrong. And that's another irony in this. And he's willing to call this stuff rigged and wrong and fake news. Yet in his own Twitter feed, he constantly links to things that are just simply not true, clearly, verifiably not true. So, I mean, you want to look at a purveyor of rigged and fake news, you have to go no further than the president of the United States, who does it all the time. And I think Google needed to respond to this because they've been under attack for a lot of reasons, and I think rightly in some ways. A few weeks ago on the show, we talked about Google and antitrust and so forth. And, it's something like 8 out of 10 searches in the web searches in the US go through Google. And that's a big deal. Now, it's a big deal in part because nobody outside of Google knows how their search algorithm works. And that's understandable from Google's standpoint because that's a proprietary trade secret. And Google doesn't want Bing, for instance, to know how it works because they don't want Bing search they don't want to help them out. And I guess to me, one interesting thing about this is, again, if you're an orthodox Republican, the idea that anyone in government, including especially the president of the United States, should be saying, well, we're going to be looking at this, telling this business how it should run its business and what kind of algorithms it should use and what kind of results it should give to people. My God, that's massive interference of government into the private sector, and that should set every orthodox Republican or libertarian's teeth on edge. And yet the Republican can, the president can blithely say this, and his chief economic advisor can say, "Oh, we're going to look into this." But God, man, there's a First Amendment here, and there's this whole idea that government should stay out of this anyway, and yet, again, up is down, black is white. It's just crazy town.
No, I completely agree. And what's interesting, particularly this week, is I think that Google got a pass because Donald Trump sucked up all the oxygen in this fight. Because the thing that happened this week, and I think this is actually one of the reasons that Google responded, I really do. This week it came to light a deal between Google and MasterCard, that MasterCard data was getting funneled back to Google so that they could put your searches together with your purchases. And that had not been properly disclosed. So if I'm Google and that comes out, I'm actually going to be sitting there going, woo-hoo, thank you, Trump, for coming after us or something stupid, because then we're going to look kind of awesome if we come back at you. And I have noticed very few outlets picked up outside the kind of the techie outlets that I follow that MasterCard has been the first credit card to enter into an agreement with a social giant like Google.
Yeah. I totally missed that. That is really interesting. And it gets to the larger point, I think, is people tend to focus on the ideological bias or lack thereof. But, given what we know about how these things work, I would say that's not the real issue. That's certainly not the thing that scares me. The thing that scares me is what's being done with our data, behind the scenes, things that we don't come anywhere close to appreciation, like for instance, that MasterCard deal, that sort of thing. And that's why I actually think that Google does need to be looked at a lot more closely along the lines of what the European Union did, because when we're giving one entity so much data and so much control over our everyday lives, I think a certain enhanced scrutiny is important, and certainly not getting that. And that's a major concern to me.
Agree. And from the libertarian point of view, I think the thing that's even more concerning is that these kinds of deals are not public, right? It's one thing to enter into agreements. So maybe you say, okay, fine, I'm okay with Google having this, and I want a MasterCard that allows them to do that. But the fact that these kinds of things are not disclosed, that's not a free market issue. That and as a result, I think that's the kinds of problems that unfortunately get buried because they're not nearly as sexy as what's happening on Donald Trump's Twitter feed and that kind of back and forth between a company and Trump.
Yeah. Yeah, I just I think fundamentally that these algorithms and that we're sort of gradually giving up our life to are making us less and less free in ways that the vast majority of people simply don't understand. And I can see this sort of dystopian future when we, look back 10, 15 years and say, oh my God, how did this happen? And again, this is me just being really dark this week. I think I was pretty dark the last time we were out. I don't know. It's not you, Trey, I promise. But yeah, this is really I've really gotten really interested in this lately, and something we'll be talking about maybe a little bit on the bonus show. But this is one example where I think this week, for instance, Senator Hatch suggested that the FTC should investigate Google, and I think there's maybe something to that. That again, we need to be a little more cautious about how much power these behind the scenes power these entities are having. But the idea that Google is rigging the system against Donald Trump I think is somewhat ludicrous, but there are deeper and more fundamental concerns to worry about here, I think.
Agreed. And it's interesting because this actually kind of leads us to our next topic. Now, you and Jay had talked about this a little bit, but there has been some additional developments on that, and that's 3D printed guns. On Monday, a federal court in Washington blocked Cody Wilson's company called Defense Distributed, which is a fascinating name, from putting his 3D printed gun schematics online. Now, he's going to actually end up doing that anyway, but the way he's going to end up doing it is by charging a fee for them, because that actually puts it into a slightly different category. Now, one of the interesting takes on this, and as a matter of fact, I don't always recommend this, but for listeners, if you want kind of an interesting take on the details, the technical side of this, I actually recommend heading to Slate. Slate has a really fascinating take, and it's not really generally Slate. You're kind of thinking of a political take, but they're going to have a very technical take on this. And it's interesting because one of the problems with the rulings that have come so far is that they are couched in language that is from the 1990s and doesn't really take into effect what's happening now. So, Michael, I know we've been talking about this before, but now we have this kind of new take on 3D printed guns. It's out there. We've got the states are suing. What do you think?
I'm torn on this. I certainly understand people's concern with it. And, the administration's position, they pretty clearly said that, undetectable guns that you can make in a 3D printer, they're already illegal and they're committed to enforcing that law. And so, I think they see it pretty clearly as a First Amendment and individual freedom type of issue. And I get that. Position. And I'm a strong supporter of the First Amendment too. But the more I thought about it, and I read, portions at least of Judge Lasnik's ruling, and, he points out that, and I'll just read a bit of it. He said, the court finds that the irreparable burdens on private defendants' First Amendment rights are dwarfed by the irreparable harms the states are likely to suffer if the existing restrictions are withdrawn. And what he's getting at here, I think, is an important point, is that none of these rights are absolute. And there's always this balance that the courts need to weigh, when constitutional rights are being abridged. And to me, there's no question. I mean, how can you have a question that First Amendment rights are being abridged here? But when that happens, the court needs to apply strict scrutiny, with that burden of proof being on the state to show how that there's this clearly overriding public need to deny that right that's being abridged. And that's a really tough legal standard to meet. And I don't know. I think, like I said, I have a lot of trouble with this because, as a strong supporter of the First Amendment, but this idea that 3D printed guns, are out there. But then again, and this is what Jay and I talked about, the idea that can you really stop this sort of thing, and are you doing damage to the First Amendment essentially by trying to stop something that can't be stopped? I mean, you suggested already that they're finding a way to get around this by charging for it, and given how information gets out on the internet, I mean, is this going to practically do anything? And I don't know. It's certainly a scary future. And as Jay and I talked about last time, right now, to be able to print a really viable 3D printed gun, you need a pretty extensive setup. It's not like you can go to Staples and buy a 3D printer and you're,
No.
you're good to go or something like that. This is to buy a really good 3D printed gun, make one. You're talking tens of thousands of dollars, that kind of thing. And honestly, there are just a lot of other cheap, almost undetectable guns out there already that this isn't really an issue for now. This is more an issue, I would say, for 5-10 years in the future, where the technology will certainly become more affordable and much better.
Yeah,
So
because even as it stands right now, a plastic gun that you're printing is not finished until you've put in metal parts. I mean, at a
yeah,
minimum, you have to have a metal firing pin, and there's no way around that right now.
yeah. And that when guns that have been built, even all plastic, they sometimes blow up, which isn't something you want with a gun, certainly. And so yeah, this is not a sort of an immediate threat to public safety in the way I think some people think. Oh, does that mean I can just print a gun? Well, not really exactly, but which is why I know, and maybe listeners say, well, geez, Mike, don't you have it come out on some side of this thing? And it's a real struggle for me, because I feel that these two very important things are in tension here. That again, this public safety sort of thing, which I don't see as a clear and present danger right now, but I do see it as one in the near term future, potentially, given how technology works. But I guess because I don't see it as a clear and present danger threat right now, that's why I tend to err on the side of the First Amendment here, which is why I think I sort of support the Trump administration's view on this, which is weird. This is the second thing in this show I've said. I kind of support the president on this, first with the Canada dairy things, and now this. So it's not becoming a stealth Trumpian or
Is this
anything
why you've
like
been
that. But
feeling bad this week, that you're
I,
agreeing
I
too much with the Trump
I don't know.
administration?
I didn't sleep really well last night. Maybe something's affecting my thinking. I don't know, but yeah. So I guess that in the end, this is where I come down. That's where I came down when Jay and I talked about the last time, saying that I think actually the Trump administration's handling of this, I tend to support that a little more than how the Obama administration did. And for listeners who didn't catch that show, basically what happened is, the reason why this became a thing now is that the Obama administration basically put a halt to their printing this, but the Trump administration entered into an agreement with was it Defense Distributed, so they
Yes.
could print these things. And I think, again, the First Amendment's awfully important to me. I don't think it's really all that important to the president, exactly, given our last story. But in this case, I think, even a broken clock's right twice a day, I think. And so I think the president, the administration's stance on this is the right one. But I certainly understand people who would say otherwise.
Well, I was thinking about this, and I think one of the ways to try to figure out how ought we to consider, when you have something so new, how we ought to consider that, is to look at something that used to be new and look how it went through a similar potential process. And I think there's two examples. One, now again, I recognize, listeners, that this is not a perfect analogy, but pornography. This is an issue where you had states were regulating it, and its ability to be regulated was shifted because of an online distribution model. And it comes along with, while we're not talking about the kind of harm that we are with 3D printed guns, nevertheless, a kind of a potential harm that many people saw as being potentially devastating to communities. Now, again, I'm not saying that I agree with that as a libertarian, but that doesn't mean that that wasn't the same kind of values that were being held by the people at the time. And I think one of the things you have to be careful of is to note that you need to make sure that your regulatory system, whatever that's going to be, actually matches what can happen in your technological realm. And I think pornography was an area where technology leapfrogged the regulatory framework so quickly that it never really caught up in a real way. I mean, even today, if you're going to log in, I mean, who knows what their obscenity standards are in their particular state, and has that ever once prevented anybody from, downloading pornography if they wanted to?
Yeah.
So the question here becomes is no matter what I think government's stance on the First Amendment issue is, you're going to have access to these schematics online. So I think the better question to ask is, you can either become the irrelevant law, which is what happened in the case of pornography, or you can say, well, what kinds of outcomes do we actually want, and what would be actually technologically feasible to regulate to make those happen? And I think that's where we need to be focused. And I think that's where the court needs to be focused. And this is not an easy thing for a court to do, because what a court does is look at the past to make decisions about what you ought to do in a present case. But in this particular instance, I think you really have to look and say, what will be the future? And rule from that position, because otherwise you're going to end up with a bunch of things that are statutes. But if it's happening anyway, what's the point? So even if the court ends up siding against the distribution of guns, if it can't in fact technically prevent it, what have you done?
Yeah, that's a great point, Trey. I hadn't thought about that, but I think that's an excellent point. And so, maybe a better way to go about this would be, for instance, more regulation or a certain type of regulation on 3D printers that are capable of printing guns,
Exactly.
Which isn't all of them. That I really like that idea. I was thinking also, I just recently typed in, maybe I shouldn't have done this, typed into Google, how to build a fertilizer bomb. And you know what happened? I mean, maybe agents will come to my home. I don't know, but I got all kinds of. It was really easy. I could, if I wanted to, I could build a fertilizer bomb. Right away, I guess, if I just went and got some fertilizer, that sort of thing. But my point being is, it's a similar kind of thing, right? The information is out there, and so I think that the proper regulatory focus is on not trying to stop the flow of information, which, as you point out, is probably just going to make the law, irrelevant and impossible to enforce, and that's an even bigger problem. Rather, the focus on the outcomes, and I think that's a great point, Trey.
Well, thank you. Sometimes I can be brilliant. No,
Yeah, absolutely, I think so.
Well, listeners, I want to let you know that as we get done here today, we are going to be filming our bonus show. So you still have time to get us on the bonus show if you head to politicsguys.com/support or head to politicsguys.com and click on support. This is what makes the show keep going. So we hope that you liked what you heard. Please, even if you aren't subscribing, we ask that you will share episodes, you'll rate us on iTunes, share us with friends and family. As always, you can get a hold of us at mail@politicsguys.com or facebook.com/politicsguys, where we have ongoing interesting debates, or Twitter, where we're at politicsguys. The executive producers are Michael Baranowski, Jay Carson, Trey Orndorff, and Bruce Johnson. This episode was produced by Trey Orndorff. There'll be a new show on Wednesday. We hope you'll join us then.